The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Bagram Airfield as Captain Sarah, Phantom 7, Mitchell stepped out of the transport helicopter. The rotor wash whipped her hair around her face, but she didn't flinch. She'd been through worse, much worse. Afghanistan in 2011 was no place for the weak, and Sarah Mitchell was anything but weak. At 28, she commanded a reconnaissance unit that had become legendary among the troops stationed there. Her call sign, Phantom 7, wasn't just a random assignment from some bored radio operator. She'd earned it through 3 years of operations that defied explanation, missions that seemed impossible until she made them look routine. The base was buzzing with unusual activity. Word had spread that Colonel James Harrison was arriving for an inspection. Harrison wasn't just any Marine colonel. He was a decorated veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, a man who'd seen everything the military had to offer. He'd commanded tank battalions, led infantry charges, and survived more firefights than most soldiers could count. At 52, he was being considered for promotion to brigadier general, and this inspection tour was part of his final evaluation. Sarah walked toward the command center, her boots crunching on the gravel. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd proven herself repeatedly under fire. Other soldiers nodded as she passed. Some called out greetings. "Morning, Phantom 7. Looking forward to the show today, Captain." She'd been briefed about the colonel's visit 3 days earlier. Major Rodriguez, her commanding officer, had been unusually nervous during the briefing. "Mitchell, I need you to understand something. Colonel Harrison has specifically requested to observe your team's capabilities. Word about your unconventional methods has reached higher command levels." Sarah had simply nodded. She was used to skepticism from higher-ups. Her methods were unconventional because conventional methods got people killed. In 3 years of operations, she hadn't lost a single soldier under her direct command. That kind of record didn't happen by accident. Her team was already assembled when she reached the briefing room. 12 of the finest soldiers she'd ever worked with, each one hand-picked not just for their skills, but for their ability to think independently under pressure. Sergeant Marcus Thompson, her second-in-command, looked up from the tactical map spread across the table. "Colonel Harrison's advance team arrived an hour ago," Thompson reported. "They've been asking questions about our equipment, our procedures, our success rates. Seems like they're trying to figure out if our reputation is real or just base gossip." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "What did you tell them?" "The truth, that you've never failed a mission, that we've extracted targets from situations other units wouldn't even attempt, that you somehow know things you shouldn't be able to know." The last comment drew looks from the rest of the team. It was true, though none of them could explain it. Sarah Mitchell had an uncanny ability to predict enemy movements, to sense danger before it materialized, to know exactly when and where to strike for maximum effect. Some called it intuition. Others whispered about supernatural abilities. Sarah herself never offered explanations. The truth was more complex than her team realized. Sarah Mitchell hadn't always been Captain Mitchell. She'd grown up as Sarah Chen in a small town in California, raised by her grandmother who'd emigrated from Taiwan in the 1960s. Her grandmother had taught her things that weren't in any military manual. Ancient techniques for reading the landscape, for understanding the subtle signs that revealed human presence, for moving through hostile territory as if she were part of the environment itself. When Sarah was 16, her grandmother had told her something she'd never forgotten. "The best warriors are those who win without fighting, but when fighting becomes necessary, they win so completely that their enemies never want to face them again." Sarah had joined the Marines at 18, driven by a desire to serve her country, but also by a deeper need to test herself against the ultimate challenges. Basic training had been almost insultingly easy. Advanced infantry training, reconnaissance school, urban warfare certification, she'd excelled at everything with minimal effort. Her instructors had recommended her for officer training, noting her exceptional tactical awareness and natural leadership abilities. But it wasn't until Afghanistan that Sarah had truly discovered what she was capable of. Her first deployment had been routine reconnaissance missions, mapping Taliban supply routes and identifying high-value targets. She'd performed adequately, but nothing spectacular. It was during her second deployment that everything changed. The mission that earned her the call sign Phantom 7 had started as a simple extraction. Intelligence had located a captured American contractor being held in a Taliban compound near the Pakistani border. The compound was heavily fortified, surrounded by mountains on 3 sides, with only one viable approach route. Previous attempts by other units had failed, resulting in casualties and mission failure. Sarah's team had been assigned the mission almost as an afterthought. Command didn't expect success. They just needed to demonstrate that every possible effort had been made. Sarah had studied the intelligence reports for hours, but something about them didn't feel right. The Taliban weren't known for keeping high-value prisoners in such exposed locations. It felt like a trap. Instead of following the recommended approach route, Sarah had led her team through terrain that was considered impassable. They'd spent 18 hours moving through mountain passes that didn't appear on any map, following animal trails and dry stream beds. Her team had questioned her decisions repeatedly, but she'd insisted they continue. When they'd finally reached their objective, they'd discovered that the compound was indeed a trap. 3 other American units had been ambushed attempting the standard approach, but Sarah's route had brought them to the real location where the contractor was being held, a cave complex 2 miles from the marked compound. The extraction had been flawless. Her team had eliminated 12 Taliban fighters without taking a single casualty, rescued the contractor, and disappeared back into the mountains before enemy reinforcements could respond. The after-action report had been classified, but word had spread through the military community. Captain Mitchell had accomplished something that should have been impossible. That's when they'd started calling her Phantom 7. The number came from the 7 Taliban commanders her intelligence work had helped eliminate in subsequent missions. Each time, she'd somehow known exactly where to find them, exactly when they'd be vulnerable, exactly how to strike without warning. Now, 3 years later, Colonel Harrison was coming to see if the legends were true. Sarah looked around at her team, men and women who'd followed her into impossible situations and lived to tell about it. They were nervous about the inspection, she could tell. Not because they doubted their abilities, but because they knew how unusual their methods appeared to outsiders. "Listen up," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had kept them alive through dozens of missions. "Colonel Harrison is here because someone higher up the chain wants to know if what we do can be taught to other units. He's going to watch us work, ask questions, try to figure out our secrets." Sergeant Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "Do we have secrets, Captain? I mean, sometimes it feels like you know things the rest of us don't." Sarah considered her answer carefully. Her team deserved honesty, but there were limits to what she could explain. How could she tell them that she'd learned to read the land itself, to sense the subtle vibrations that revealed human presence, to understand the patterns of behavior that made enemies predictable? These weren't skills that could be taught in a classroom. "What we have," she said finally, "is experience. We've learned to trust our instincts, to look beyond the obvious, to think like our enemies while never becoming like them. Colonel Harrison has had different experiences. He's commanded larger units, fought different kinds of battles. Our job is to show him what small unit reconnaissance can accomplish when it's done right." The door to the briefing room opened, and Major Rodriguez entered with 3 other officers. Sarah recognized Colonel Harrison immediately. He was shorter than she'd expected, perhaps 5'9", but he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his decorations impressive but not flashy. His eyes were what caught her attention, sharp, intelligent, missing nothing. "Captain Mitchell," Major Rodriguez said, "I'd like you to meet Colonel James Harrison." Sarah stepped forward and saluted crisply. "Colonel Harrison, welcome to Forward Operating Base Chapman. My team is ready for whatever demonstration you'd like to see." Harrison returned the salute, then studied her face intently. "Captain, I've been reading reports about your unit for the past month. Frankly, some of the claims seem too good to be true. 0 casualties over 3 years of operations. Mission success rates approaching 100%. Either you're the luckiest officer in the Corps, or you're doing something fundamentally different from everyone else." "We prepare thoroughly, sir. We adapt to changing conditions. We never underestimate our enemies." "That's what every competent officer says," Harrison replied. "But competent officers still lose people. Good officers still fail missions. What makes you different?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "With respect, sir, I think that's something you'll need to observe for yourself. Words can't adequately explain what we do." Harrison nodded slowly. "Fair enough. I understand you have a live mission scheduled for tonight. Reconnaissance of a suspected weapons cache near the Pakistan border. I'd like to observe your planning process, your preparation, and if possible, the mission itself." "Of course, sir. though I should mention that our planning methods might seem unconventional. I'm counting on it, Harrison said. If your methods were conventional, I wouldn't be here. The rest of the morning was spent reviewing intelligence reports and preparing for the evening mission. Sarah could feel Colonel Harrison watching her every move, noting how she analyzed terrain maps, how she questioned the reliability of various intelligence sources, how she discussed contingencies with her team. What he couldn't observe was the deeper process happening in Sarah's mind. She wasn't just reading reports, she was feeling the truth behind them. Years of operating in this region had taught her to distinguish between reliable intelligence and wishful thinking. The suspected weapons cache was real, she was certain of that, but the intelligence about enemy strength was incomplete. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the base, Sarah called her team together for final mission briefing. Colonel Harrison and his staff officers took seats in the back of the room, notebooks ready to document everything they observed. The target location is here, Sarah began, pointing to a spot on the map 15 kilometers northeast of their position. Intelligence suggests a cache of Chinese-manufactured weapons, possibly including anti-aircraft missiles. Enemy strength estimated at 8 to 12 fighters. She paused, studying the terrain features around the target area. Something felt wrong about the intelligence estimate, but she couldn't yet put her finger on what. Sergeant Thompson will lead the approach team. Corporal Martinez handles communications. Specialist Wang provides overwatch from this ridge line. She traced routes on the map with practiced efficiency, but her mind was working on multiple levels, processing information in ways her military training had never taught her. Colonel Harrison leaned forward. Captain, how do you determine your approach routes? I notice you're not following standard tactical doctrine for this type of mission. Sarah looked at him directly. Standard doctrine assumes certain things about enemy behavior, terrain usage, and probability factors. In this region, those assumptions often prove incorrect. We've learned to adapt our methods based on actual conditions rather than theoretical models. Can you be more specific? Sarah hesitated. How could she explain that she'd learned to read the landscape like a living thing, to sense where dangers lurked and where safe passage could be found? It's difficult to put into words, sir. Much of what we do is based on accumulated experience that becomes intuitive over time. Harrison's expression didn't change, but she could see skepticism in his eyes. He'd heard similar explanations before from officers who couldn't adequately explain their failures. Sarah understood his doubt. From his perspective, she was just another captain making vague claims about special abilities. But tonight's mission would be different. Tonight, Colonel Harrison would see for himself what Phantom 7 could do. As darkness fell over the Afghan mountains, Sarah made final preparations for what would become the most important mission of her career. She had no way of knowing that in less than 6 hours, she would do something that would haunt Colonel Harrison's dreams for years to come. Something that would force him to question everything he thought he knew about warfare, about leadership, and about the limits of human capability. The convoy departed at 2100 hours, heading northeast toward the Pakistani border. In the lead vehicle, Sarah reviewed her mental map of the terrain one final time. Tonight would prove whether her reputation was deserved, or whether she'd simply been extraordinarily lucky for 3 years. Colonel Harrison rode in the second vehicle, watching the Afghan landscape roll past in the green glow of night vision equipment. He'd observed hundreds of military operations over his career, but something about this mission felt different. Whether that was good or bad remained to be seen. The convoy stopped 3 kilometers from the target location, hidden in a valley between 2 ridgelines. Sarah stepped out of the lead vehicle and immediately felt something was wrong. The night was too quiet. Even the insects seemed subdued, as if the entire landscape was holding its breath. Colonel Harrison approached her position. Captain, why are we stopping here? According to the mission plan, the dismount point should be another kilometer ahead. Sarah continued scanning the horizon through her night vision scope. Change of plans, sir. We're going to approach from a different direction. Based on what intelligence? Nothing in the briefing materials suggested any change in enemy dispositions. Sarah lowered her scope and looked directly at Harrison. Sir, with respect, the briefing materials are 12 hours old. Things change rapidly in this area. I'm recommending we circle north and approach the target from the ridge line. That will add 2 hours to the mission timeline. It will also put us dangerously close to the Pakistani border, potentially creating diplomatic complications if we're spotted. Yes, sir, but it will also keep us alive. The tension in Sarah's voice caught Harrison's attention. He'd commanded troops in combat for over 20 years, and he recognized the tone of an officer who sensed immediate danger. What exactly are you sensing, Captain? Sarah hesitated again. How could she explain that the mountains themselves felt wrong tonight? That the pattern of wind currents suggested human presence where none should exist? That her grandmother's teachings had trained her to recognize when the natural order of things had been disturbed? I can't be specific, sir, but everything in my experience tells me that the planned approach route has been compromised. If we continue as originally planned, we're going to walk into an ambush. Colonel Harrison studied her face in the green glow of the night vision equipment. 20 years of military service had taught him to recognize different types of officers. There were the ones who craved glory and took unnecessary risks. There were the ones who were paralyzed by fear and avoided all risks. And then there were the rare ones who possessed an almost supernatural ability to read dangerous situations. Looking at Captain Mitchell, Harrison found himself remembering a sergeant he'd served within Iraq. That sergeant had possessed similar instincts, an uncanny ability to predict insurgent attacks. Harrison had learned to trust those instincts completely after they'd saved his unit from 3 separate ambushes. All right, Captain, we do this your way, but I want a full explanation of your reasoning in the after-action report. Understood, sir. Sarah gathered her team leaders around the map table set up in the back of one of the vehicles. We're changing the approach route. Instead of following the main valley, we're going to circle north and come down from the ridge line. Sergeant Thompson looked skeptical. Captain, that's going to put us right on the border if Pakistani forces spot us. They won't spot us, Sarah said with quiet confidence. We're going to move through the high passes following the goat trails. It'll be slower, but we'll have complete concealment. How do you know about goat trails that aren't on any of our maps? Asked Corporal Martinez. Because I've been studying this region for 3 years. I know where the local herders move their animals, which paths they use where they never go. Tonight we're going to use their knowledge. Colonel Harrison listened to this exchange with growing interest. Most officers relied heavily on intelligence reports, satellite imagery, and electronic surveillance. Captain Mitchell seemed to operate on a completely different level, drawing from sources of information that weren't available to conventional military analysis. The team began preparing for the modified mission. Equipment was redistributed, ammunition checked, communications protocols reviewed. Sarah moved among her soldiers, speaking quietly with each one, offering encouragement and specific instructions. Harrison noticed that her troops responded to her with a combination of respect and genuine affection that was rare in military units. At 22:45 hours, they began the approach march. Instead of following the valley floor as originally planned, Sarah led them up a steep incline toward the ridge line. The terrain was treacherous, loose rocks and hidden crevices that could easily twist an ankle or worse. But Sarah moved through it as if she'd traveled this route dozens of times. Colonel Harrison found himself struggling to maintain the pace. He was in excellent physical condition for a 52-year-old officer, but Sarah Mitchell was setting a demanding rhythm. More impressive than her physical capabilities, however, was her obvious familiarity with terrain that supposedly she'd never traversed before. Captain, he called softly during a brief rest stop, how exactly do you know this route? None of our intelligence reports mention these trails. Local knowledge, sir. Over 3 years, you learn to notice patterns, where the rocks are worn smooth by frequent use, where the vegetation has been disturbed by regular foot traffic, where the paths lead and where they don't. That's still not explaining how you know this specific route is safe. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering how much to reveal. Sir, my grandmother taught me to read the land. She grew up in mountain country in Taiwan, and she learned things from her grandfather that were never written down in any book. How to move through difficult terrain without leaving traces, how to sense when you're being watched, how to distinguish between natural sounds and artificial ones. Harrison stared at her in the darkness. You're telling me that your tactical abilities come from folk wisdom learned from your grandmother? Partially, yes, sir, combined with military training and 3 years of practical experience in this specific area. And you believe this gives you capabilities that other officers lack? I believe it gives me different capabilities, sir. Whether they're superior or not depends on the specific situation. They resumed the march, climbing higher into the mountains. The air grew thinner and colder, but Sarah maintained the same steady pace. Behind them, Colonel Harrison's breathing became more labored, but he refused to ask for a slower pace. His staff officers were struggling even more visibly. At 30 hours, they reached the ridge line. Sarah called for a halt and moved forward to reconnoiter the target area. Through her scope, she could see the suspected weapons cache location, a cluster of buildings in a valley 500 meters below their position. What she saw confirmed her earlier instincts. The intelligence estimates had been completely wrong. "Sir, you need to see this," she called softly to Colonel Harrison. Harrison moved up to her position and accepted the night vision scope. "What am I looking at?" "Count the enemy positions." Harrison studied the scene below. Gradually, he began to identify individual fighters moving between the buildings. "I count 15, maybe 20. The intelligence report estimated 8 to 12. "I count 23, Sarah said quietly. "Plus 2 heavy machine gun positions that weren't mentioned in the briefing, and look at the valley floor where we were supposed to approach from." Harrison shifted his view to the original approach route. Even in the green glow of night vision, he could see the signs of recent excavation. "Fighting positions. They've dug in along the entire approach route." "Yes, sir. If we'd followed the original plan, we would have walked into a kill zone with 23 fighters in prepared positions and heavy weapons for support." Colonel Harrison handed back the scope, his mind racing. How had Captain Mitchell known? The intelligence briefing had given no indication of increased enemy strength or prepared positions. Yet somehow she'd sensed the danger and chosen an alternative approach that revealed the true situation. "Captain, how did you know?" "I didn't know, sir, but the original intelligence didn't feel right. Too much certainty about things that should have been uncertain. Too convenient that the enemy would position themselves exactly where our intelligence expected them to be." "So you changed the entire mission plan based on intuition?" "Based on experience, sir. In 3 years of operations, I've learned that when something feels wrong, it usually is wrong." Harrison studied the target area again. Even with the advantage of the high ground, this was going to be a difficult mission. 23 enemy fighters in prepared positions, with heavy weapons and multiple escape routes. Standard doctrine would recommend calling in air support or artillery before attempting any ground assault. "What's your recommendation, Captain?" Sarah had been considering the same question. A direct assault would be costly, possibly resulting in casualties among her team. But she'd also noticed something that the enemy fighters apparently hadn't considered. "Sir, look at their positions again. Notice anything unusual about their defensive layout." Harrison studied the scene more carefully. They're focused entirely on the valley approach. All their fighting positions face south. "Exactly. They've prepared for the attack they expected, but they haven't considered the possibility of an approach from this direction. Their entire defensive plan assumes we'll come from the valley." "So what do you propose?" "We split into 2 elements. Thompson leads half the team down to create a diversion at the southern end of their perimeter. While they're focused on that threat, the rest of us approach from the north and secure the weapons cache. That's putting Thompson's element at serious risk. They'll be outnumbered 3 to 1. Not if we time it correctly. Thompson's job isn't to fight them, it's to get their attention and then withdraw. By the time they realize what happened, we'll have completed the primary mission and be gone." Colonel Harrison considered the plan. It was audacious, requiring split-second timing and perfect execution. If anything went wrong, half of Sarah's team could be overrun and killed. But if it worked, they could accomplish the mission with minimal casualties. "All right, Captain, but I want to modify the plan slightly. Instead of Thompson leading the diversion, I want you to take personal command of that element." Sarah looked at him in surprise. "Sir, with respect, the northern approach requires someone who knows these mountains, if I'm not leading that element." "Sergeant Thompson can lead the northern element. He's one of your most experienced NCOs. Meanwhile, I want to observe your decision-making process under direct fire." "Colonel, I strongly recommend against that modification. Thompson is excellent, but he doesn't have the local knowledge necessary to navigate the northern approach in darkness." "Then brief him thoroughly. You have 15 minutes. Sarah recognized the tone of a direct order. Colonel Harrison wasn't making a tactical decision. He was making an evaluation decision. He wanted to see how she performed when her preferred plan was modified by higher authority. She gathered Thompson and quickly briefed him on the northern route. Using the map and pointing out terrain features visible in the darkness, she explained the approach path, potential obstacles, and rally points. Thompson absorbed the information with the professionalism of a career NCO, but Sarah could see concern in his eyes. "Captain, are you sure about this? I've never operated in this type of terrain." "You'll be fine, Marcus. Trust your instincts and remember everything I just told you. The path is more straightforward than it looks." At 1:15 hours, the two elements separated. Sarah led 6 soldiers down toward the southern end of the enemy perimeter, while Thompson took the remaining 6 toward the northern approach. Colonel Harrison accompanied Sarah's element, along with one of his staff officers. The descent was treacherous, requiring careful placement of each step to avoid dislodging loose rocks that could alert the enemy. Sarah moved like a ghost, finding secure footing even in complete darkness. Behind her, Colonel Harrison struggled to match her pace while maintaining noise discipline. They reached their position 500 meters south of the enemy perimeter at 1:45 hours. Sarah called for a final equipment check, then established radio contact with Thompson's element. "Hammer Base, this is Phantom 7. Status report." "Phantom 7, Hammer Base. We're in position. Northern approach is clear, ready to proceed on your signal." "Copy that, Hammer Base. Initiate approach at 200 hours. Diversion begins at 2:05. Sarah checked her watch. 15 minutes to final execution. She looked at Colonel Harrison, who was studying the enemy positions through his own night vision scope. "Sir, once we initiate contact, things are going to happen very quickly. I recommend you stay close to my position and follow my lead exactly." "Understood, Captain. This is your show." At 200 hours precisely, Thompson's element began their approach to the weapons cache from the north. Sarah watched the enemy positions carefully, looking for any sign that they'd been detected. The Taliban fighters remained focused on their prepared positions facing south, unaware that American soldiers were moving through the darkness behind them. At 2:05, Sarah's element opened fire. The effect was immediate and dramatic. 23 enemy fighters suddenly found themselves under attack from an unexpected direction. Muzzle flashes erupted from their positions as they returned fire, but they were shooting at ghosts. Sarah had positioned her element in a location that provided excellent concealment while giving the impression of a much larger attacking force. Colonel Harrison watched in fascination as Sarah orchestrated the engagement. She wasn't simply firing at enemy positions. She was manipulating their responses, drawing their attention to specific areas while keeping them confused about the size and location of the attacking force. "Displacement Alpha," she called to her team. Immediately, all 6 soldiers shifted to pre-planned secondary positions, maintaining the illusion that they were a much larger force attacking from multiple directions. The Taliban fighters were beginning to panic. Radio chatter increased dramatically as they tried to coordinate their response to what seemed like a coordinated assault from an entire American company. Some fighters abandoned their positions to reinforce areas where they thought the main attack was coming from. "Hammer Base, this is Phantom 7. Enemy attention is fully engaged. Execute primary mission." "Phantom 7, Hammer Base, moving to target now." While the enemy was distracted by Sarah's diversion, Thompson's element approached the weapons cache from the completely undefended northern approach. Within minutes, they had neutralized the 2 guards and begun documenting the contents of the cache. "Phantom 7, Hammer Base, we have jackpot. Repeat, we have jackpot. Significant weapons and ammunition stores confirmed. Beginning extraction of priority items." Sarah smiled grimly. The mission was proceeding exactly as planned, but now came the most dangerous part, withdrawing both elements without casualties. "All elements, prepare for extraction. Hammer Base, you have 10 minutes to complete documentation and prepare selected items for transport." "Copy, Phantom 7, 10 minutes." Sarah began the complex process of disengaging from contact with a numerically superior enemy force. It required precise timing and careful coordination to avoid being overrun during the withdrawal. Colonel Harrison found himself completely absorbed in watching Sarah work. Her tactical decision-making under pressure was unlike anything he'd observed before. She seemed to anticipate enemy movements before they happened, positioning her forces to counter threats that hadn't yet materialized. At 2:30 hours, both elements successfully extracted from the target area, carrying critical intelligence about the weapon's cache and several priority items for analysis. The entire operation had taken less than 90 minutes from start to finish. As they began the march back to the extraction point, Colonel Harrison reflected on what he'd witnessed. Captain Mitchell had correctly predicted an enemy ambush, modified the mission plan to avoid it, and then executed a complex operation that accomplished all objectives while taking 0 casualties. What troubled him wasn't her success. He'd seen successful missions before. What troubled him was that he couldn't explain how she'd done it. Her tactical decisions seemed to be based on information that simply wasn't available through normal intelligence channels. By 400 hours, they were back at the vehicle extraction point. As they loaded into the convoy for the return to base, Colonel Harrison approached Sarah with a question that had been bothering him all night. "Captain, I need to ask you something directly. How did you know about the enemy ambush? What specific indicators told you that the original intelligence was wrong?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. She could see that Colonel Harrison was struggling to understand something that defied conventional military analysis. "Sir, it wasn't any specific indicator. It was the pattern of indicators that didn't fit. The intelligence was too certain about too many variables. In my experience, when you're dealing with an adaptive enemy, that level of certainty usually means you're missing something important. But that's still not explaining how you knew to change the approach route to avoid an ambush that you supposedly had no specific intelligence about." Sarah was quiet for a long moment as the convoy began moving back toward base. Finally, she spoke. "Colonel, have you ever had the experience of knowing something without being able to explain how you knew it? Not guessing, not hopping, but actually knowing." Harrison thought about it. "Once or twice, usually in combat situations where I had to make split-second decisions. That's what happened tonight, sir. I knew the original plan was wrong the same way you know when to duck during incoming artillery. You don't think about it, you just react. But that level of intuitive tactical awareness is extremely rare, Captain. Most officers never develop it, no matter how much experience they accumulate." "Yes, sir, that's probably true." As the convoy continued through the Afghan night toward base, Colonel Harrison found himself facing a dilemma. He'd been sent to evaluate Captain Mitchell and her unit to determine if their methods could be taught to other forces. What he'd discovered was an officer whose abilities seemed to transcend normal military training. The question was whether those abilities were the result of teachable skills or something else entirely, something that couldn't be replicated through standard military education. Either way, he knew his report to higher command was going to raise more questions than it answered. The convoy arrived back at base just as the first hints of dawn were appearing over the eastern mountains. Colonel Harrison watched Captain Mitchell debrief her team with the same methodical professionalism she displayed throughout the night. Each soldier reported their observations, equipment status, and any issues that needed to be addressed for future missions. What struck Harrison most was how Sarah listened. She didn't just collect information. She synthesized it, looking for patterns and connections that others might miss. When Specialist Rodriguez mentioned hearing unusual radio chatter during the extraction, Sarah immediately connected it to Thompson's observation about tire tracks near the northern approach route. "The enemy knew we might try to approach from the north," she concluded. "They just didn't have enough personnel to defend against approaches from multiple directions simultaneously. That's why they concentrated their forces on the southern approach. It was their best bet for stopping a conventional assault." "But how did they know about our mission at all?" Thompson asked. "The target location was classified until 6 hours before we departed." Sarah considered this carefully. "Someone's been watching our patterns. This is the third time in 2 months that enemy positions have been reinforced just before our arrival. Either we have a security leak, or they've learned to predict our operational procedures." Colonel Harrison leaned forward. This was exactly the kind of analytical thinking that had brought him to Afghanistan. "What's your assessment, Captain? Security leak or operational predictability?" "Operational predictability, sir. We've been using similar tactics for 3 years. The enemy has had time to study our methods and develop countermeasures. What saved us tonight was changing our approach at the last minute." Are you saying that your unit's success rate might be declining as the enemy adapts to your methods? It's possible, sir, which is why we constantly modify our procedures. What worked last year might not work this year. What works this month might not work next month. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. This was a more sophisticated analysis than he'd expected. Most officers focused on perfecting their existing methods. Sarah Mitchell understood that tactical superiority required constant evolution. After the formal debrief, Harrison asked Sarah to join him for a private conversation. They walked to the base's observation deck, where they could speak without interruption while overlooking the Afghan landscape in the growing daylight. Captain, I've been observing military operations for over 20 years. What I saw tonight was exceptional by any standard, but I'm troubled by some aspects of how you operate. In what way, sir? Your tactical decisions seem to be based on information that isn't available through normal intelligence channels. You appear to know things that you shouldn't be able to know. That makes it difficult to evaluate whether your methods can be taught to other officers. Sarah had been expecting this conversation. Every senior officer who observed her unit eventually reached the same conclusion. Sir, what specific aspects concern you? Start with tonight's mission. You changed the approach route based on what you called intuition, but that intuition proved to be remarkably accurate. You predicted enemy strength and positions that weren't revealed by our intelligence assets. How do you explain that? Sarah looked out over the mountains where they'd operated just hours earlier. Colonel, may I ask you a personal question? Go ahead. In your 20 years of military service, have you ever served with someone who seemed to have extraordinary instincts? Someone who could sense danger before anyone else, who made decisions that seemed impossible but turned out to be exactly right. Harrison thought immediately of Sergeant Williams, the NCO who'd saved his unit multiple times in Iraq. Yes, I have. How did you explain that person's abilities? I didn't try to explain them, I just learned to trust them. That's what my team has learned to do with me, sir. They don't understand how I make certain decisions, but they've seen the results often enough to trust the process. But that's not an adequate explanation for a formal evaluation report, Captain. Higher command needs to know if your methods can be replicated. If they can't be taught to other officers, then your value is limited to this single unit. Sarah understood his dilemma. The Marine Corps was a large organization that needed standardized procedures and reproducible results. Individual officers with unique abilities were interesting anomalies, but they couldn't be the foundation of institutional capability. Sir, let me ask you another question. In your experience, what percentage of officers ever develop truly exceptional tactical instincts? Very few, maybe 5%, and that's probably generous. And of those 5%, how many develop those instincts through formal training versus practical experience? Harrison considered this. Practical experience, definitely. The best tactical officers I've known were made by combat, not by schools. So the real question isn't whether my specific methods can be taught in a classroom. The question is whether other officers can be given enough practical experience to develop their own exceptional instincts. That's an interesting way to frame it, but practical experience takes years to accumulate, and it requires actual combat operations. We can't manufacture that kind of experience artificially. No, sir, we can't. But we can identify officers who show potential and give them opportunities to develop it. We can teach them to question assumptions, to look beyond obvious solutions, to trust their instincts when the situation demands it. Colonel Harrison was beginning to understand why Captain Mitchell had attracted attention at higher command levels. She wasn't just an exceptional tactician. She was a strategic thinker who understood the broader implications of what she was doing. Captain, I'd like to discuss your background. Your personnel file shows that you grew up in California, but you mentioned earlier that your grandmother taught you skills that contribute to your tactical abilities. Can you elaborate on that? Sarah had been dreading this question. Her grandmother's teachings were deeply personal, rooted in cultural traditions that were difficult to explain to Western military professionals. My grandmother emigrated from Taiwan in the 1960s. She grew up in mountain country where survival depended on understanding the land intimately. She taught me to read terrain, weather patterns, animal behavior, things that aren't covered in military training, but that can be crucial in operations like last night's mission. Are you saying that your tactical abilities are based on folk wisdom from Taiwan? Partially, yes, sir, but also on 3 years of applying that wisdom to modern military operations in Afghanistan. It's not just ancient knowledge, it's ancient knowledge adapted to current realities. Harrison was struggling to process this information. How could he write a report explaining that one of the Marine Corps' most successful reconnaissance officers relied on techniques learned from her Taiwanese grandmother? Captain, help me understand this practically. If I wanted to reproduce your unit's capabilities, what would I need to do? Sarah thought carefully before answering. You'd need to select officers who show aptitude for unconventional thinking. You'd need to give them extensive practical experience in the specific area where they'll be operating. You'd need to encourage them to question standard procedures and develop their own methods. And you'd need to accept that some of them will fail. Fail how? Some officers will never develop reliable instincts, no matter how much experience they accumulate. Others will develop overconfidence and start taking unnecessary risks. A few might develop the kind of tactical awareness that makes them exceptionally effective. So you're describing a selection and training process that would have a very high failure rate. Yes, sir, but the ones who succeed would be extremely valuable. Harrison was beginning to see the scope of the problem. The Marine Corps could probably identify officers with potential for exceptional tactical development, but the cost and time required to develop that potential would be enormous, and there was no guarantee of success. Captain, let me ask you a hypothetical question. If you were asked to train a group of young officers in your methods, how would you approach it? I'd start by taking them into the field for extended periods, not for specific missions, but for general familiarization with the area. They'd need to learn the terrain, the weather patterns, the local population, the enemy's habits and preferences. How long would that take? Minimum of 6 months for basic familiarity, probably 2 years to develop reliable instincts. And during that time, they wouldn't be available for normal operational duties. Correct, sir. It would be a significant investment with uncertain returns. Harrison was beginning to understand why higher command was interested in Sarah's methods, but also why they were reluctant to commit resources to replicating them. The military needed solutions that could be implemented quickly and consistently, not experimental programs that might or might not produce results. Captain, I'd like to shift focus to another aspect of your operations. Your unit has achieved 0 casualties over 3 years. That's statistically remarkable. How much of that do you attribute to luck versus skill? Very little luck, sir. We prepare extensively for every mission. We avoid unnecessary risks. We abort missions when conditions aren't favorable, and we never underestimate our enemies. But you also undertake missions that other units consider too dangerous to attempt. How do you reconcile those apparently contradictory approaches? We take calculated risks, sir. We analyze situations more thoroughly than most units, which allows us to identify opportunities that others miss. Last night's mission is a good example. The original plan was actually riskier than our modified approach because it was based on incomplete intelligence. So you're saying that what appears to be risk-taking is actually risk reduction through better analysis. Exactly, sir. Most military casualties result from inadequate preparation or failure to adapt to changing conditions. We spend more time on preparation than most units, and we're willing to change our plans when the situation demands it. Harrison was impressed by this analysis. It suggested that Sarah's methods weren't mystical or inexplicable, but rather the result of more thorough preparation and more flexible thinking than was typical in military operations. Captain, I have one more question about last night's mission. When you decided to change the approach route, you did so despite strong pressure from higher command to follow the original plan. That required significant personal courage, because if the mission had failed, you would have been held responsible for departing from approved procedures. Yes, sir, that's true. How do you make that kind of decision? How do you know when to trust your instincts over formal orders? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun rise over the Afghan mountains. Sir, I think about my responsibility to my soldiers. My job isn't to follow orders blindly, it's to accomplish the mission while bringing my people home alive. When those two objectives conflict, I have to choose. And you're willing to accept the career consequences of making the wrong choice. I'm willing to accept the career consequences of making any choice, sir. What I'm not willing to accept is losing soldiers because I was afraid to think for myself. Colonel Harrison studied her face in the morning light. Captain Sarah Mitchell wasn't just an exceptional tactical officer. She was a leader who understood the weight of command in a way that many senior officers never learned. Captain, I'm going to be honest with you about something. I came here expecting to find either a fraud or someone whose reputation was based on luck and exaggeration. What I've found instead is an officer whose capabilities raise fundamental questions about how we train and evaluate military leadership. Thank you, sir. That's not necessarily a compliment. It means that your existence creates problems for the Marine Corps. You represent capabilities that we don't know how to replicate or even properly evaluate. Sarah nodded. I understand, sir. I've always known that my methods were difficult to fit into standard military procedures. The question is what we do about it. Do we try to study your methods and develop training programs based on them? Do we simply acknowledge that you're an exceptional individual and leave it at that? Or do we try to find other officers with similar potential and give them opportunities to develop it? What would you recommend, sir? Harrison was quiet for several minutes, watching military personnel begin their daily routines across the base below them. I think we need to be very careful about trying to systematize something that might not be systematizable. But I also think we'd be foolish to ignore the lessons your experience offers. Which are? That exceptional military performance often requires going beyond standard procedures. That the best officers are those who can think independently while still working within the military framework. And that we need to create more opportunities for promising officers to develop through practical experience rather than just classroom training. As they walked back toward the command center, Colonel Harrison realized that his evaluation of Captain Mitchell had become something much more complex than he'd anticipated. She represented both the potential and the problems of exceptional individual capability within a large military organization. His report to higher command would have to address not just what Sarah Mitchell could do, but what her example meant for the future of military leadership development. It was a responsibility that would require careful thought and precise language. Because what he'd witnessed over the past 24 hours had the potential to change how the Marine Corps thought about training and developing its officers. Or it could simply be filed away as an interesting anomaly that had no practical application to broader military needs. The difference would depend on how well he could explain what he'd seen and what it meant. 3 days after the successful weapons cache mission, Colonel Harrison found himself facing an unexpected situation. Intelligence had reported a time-sensitive target of opportunity. A high-value Taliban commander would be meeting with Pakistani ISI contacts at a remote location near the border. The window for intervention was less than 18 hours, far too short for conventional planning and approval processes. The base commander, General Morrison, called an emergency briefing at 600 hours. Present were Harrison, Captain Mitchell, Major Rodriguez, and the senior intelligence officer, Lieutenant Colonel Barnes. Gentlemen and Captain Mitchell, General Morrison began, we've received actionable intelligence about a meeting that could significantly impact operations in this region. The target is Mullah Qadir, one of the most senior Taliban commanders still operating. He's responsible for coordinating attacks against our forces and Afghan government targets. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes took over the briefing. Qadir will be meeting with 2 ISI operatives at a compound approximately 20 kilometers northeast of our position. The meeting is scheduled for tonight, sometime between 2200 and 200 hours. This represents our first opportunity to capture or eliminate Qadir in over 2 years. General Morrison looked around the room. The problem is timing. Normal planning and approval processes would take 48 to 72 hours. We have less than 18. I need recommendations on whether this mission is feasible under such constraints. Major Rodriguez spoke first. Sir, 18 hours isn't enough time for proper reconnaissance, detailed planning, and rehearsal. Standard doctrine would recommend against attempting a mission of this complexity with such limited preparation time. Colonel Harrison, your assessment. Harrison considered carefully. General, I agree with Major Rodriguez that this timeline is extremely challenging. However, I've spent the past week observing Captain Mitchell's unit, and they've demonstrated capabilities that might make this mission feasible. All eyes turned to Sarah. She'd been studying the intelligence reports during the briefing, but her expression revealed nothing about her thoughts. Captain Mitchell, can your unit execute this mission successfully with 18 hours of preparation? Sarah looked directly at General Morrison. Sir, I need to ask several questions before I can give you a reliable assessment. Go ahead. First, what's the quality of the intelligence? How confident are we about the location, timing, and number of individuals who will be present? Lieutenant Colonel Barnes answered. The intelligence comes from a source we've used successfully for 8 months. Previous information has proven accurate in 6 out of 7 cases. We're moderately confident about the location and timing, less certain about the number of additional personnel who might be present. Second question, what are the mission objectives? Capture, elimination, or intelligence gathering? General Morrison considered this. Preferred outcome is capture, but elimination is acceptable if capture proves impossible. Intelligence gathering is secondary to removing Kadir from the operational environment. Third question, what support assets are available? Air support, artillery, medical evacuation. Limited air support due to proximity to the Pakistani border. No artillery support for the same reason. Medical evacuation would be available but delayed due to distance and terrain. Sarah was quiet for several moments, processing the information. The others waited, understanding that her assessment would likely determine whether the mission proceeded. Sir, this mission is possible, but it requires accepting significant risks and modifying standard procedures. Explain. The intelligence is probably accurate about the basic facts, location, and approximate timing, but we should assume additional security personnel that haven't been reported. Kadir is too important to travel with minimal protection. Colonel Harrison leaned forward. What kind of modifications to standard procedures? We'd need to conduct reconnaissance and planning simultaneously rather than sequentially. We'd need to position assets for immediate exploitation rather than deliberate assault. And we'd need to accept that some decisions will have to be made in real time rather than during the planning phase. General Morrison studied her carefully. Captain, are you recommending that we proceed with this mission? I'm recommending that we prepare for the mission while conducting final intelligence collection. If conditions are favorable when we reach the target area, we execute. If not, we abort and withdraw. That's not how we normally conduct high-value target operations. No, sir, it's not, but normal procedures assume adequate preparation time, which we don't have. Colonel Harrison recognized the strategic thinking behind Sarah's recommendation. General, Captain Mitchell is proposing an adaptive approach that maximizes our chances of success while preserving the option to abort if conditions prove unfavorable. The risk is that we commit resources to a mission that might not be executable, Major Rodriguez pointed out. The risk of not attempting the mission is that we lose our best opportunity to remove Kadir from the battlefield, Sarah countered. He's been operating successfully for over 2 years. We may not get another chance like this. General Morrison made his decision. Very well. Captain Mitchell, you have authorization to prepare for this mission. Final execution authority will depend on your assessment of conditions at the target location. Understood, sir. The next 12 hours were unlike anything Colonel Harrison had previously observed in military planning. Instead of the methodical, sequential process normally used for complex operations, Sarah's team conducted multiple activities simultaneously. While she studied satellite imagery and intelligence reports, her team leaders conducted equipment preparation and route planning. Communications specialists established contact with potential support assets. Intelligence personnel worked to develop additional information about the target location and enemy capabilities. Most remarkably, Sarah began developing contingency plans for situations that hadn't yet been identified. We need to be ready for anything, she told her team. Normal intelligence preparation gives us time to anticipate problems and develop solutions. Tonight, we're going to encounter problems we haven't thought of. Colonel Harrison watched this process with fascination. Military planning typically involved identifying the most likely scenario and developing detailed procedures for that specific situation. Sarah was preparing for multiple scenarios simultaneously, creating a flexible framework that could adapt to whatever they encountered. At 1400 hours, she gathered her team for an unusual type of briefing. Instead of presenting a detailed operations order, she outlined general objectives and gave each team leader broad authority to adapt their specific responsibilities based on real-time conditions. Thompson, your element handles reconnaissance and initial entry. Martinez, your people provide security and communications. Wang, you're responsible for target identification and capture procedures. Everyone needs to be prepared to shift roles if the situation demands it. Captain, Sergeant Thompson asked, what if we can't locate Kadir at the target site? What if the intelligence is wrong? Then we gather what information we can and withdraw. The primary objective is Kadir, but any intelligence about Taliban operations in this area is valuable. What if we encounter Pakistani forces near the border? We avoid contact if possible. If contact is unavoidable, we identify ourselves and request permission to transit Pakistani territory in pursuit of Taliban forces. What if Kadir has more security than expected? We adapt our approach. If capture isn't feasible, we consider elimination. If elimination isn't feasible, we abort and report intelligence for future operations. Colonel Harrison realized that Sarah was teaching her team to think tactically rather than just follow procedures. Each team leader was being prepared to make independent decisions based on the specific situation they encountered. At 1800 hours, the final briefing included updated intelligence that confirmed the meeting location, but suggested the presence of additional security personnel. Sarah absorbed this information without changing her overall plan, but Harrison could see her mental calculations adjusting to accommodate the new factors. "Sir," she said to Colonel Harrison, "I want to confirm that you understand the nature of tonight's operation. This isn't going to be a textbook mission with predictable procedures. We're going to adapt continuously based on what we find." "I understand, Captain. I'm here to observe, not to interfere with your tactical decisions." "Thank you, sir. But I need you to understand that some of tonight's decisions might appear questionable until you see how they fit into the overall pattern." Harrison nodded. He was beginning to understand that observing Sarah's unit in action required a different mindset than evaluating conventional military operations. At 2000 hours, the team departed for the target location. The approach route took them through terrain that was even more challenging than the previous mission, rocky highlands with numerous ravines and potential ambush sites. Sarah had chosen this route specifically because it was unlikely to be monitored by enemy forces. As they moved through the darkness, Harrison found himself constantly surprised by Sarah's route selection. She avoided obvious paths, but also avoided areas that appeared completely impassable. The result was steady progress through terrain that seemed impossible to navigate in darkness. "Captain," he asked during a brief halt, "how do you select these routes? They don't correspond to anything I can identify on our maps." "I'm following water patterns, sir. Even in this dry climate, water shapes the landscape in ways that create natural corridors. Most of these paths were probably used by animals and local herders long before military forces arrived in the area." "And you learned this from your grandmother's teachings?" "Partially, but also from observing how local Afghans move through their environment. They don't use roads or marked trails. They follow the natural flow of the landscape." At 21:30 hours, they reached a position overlooking the target location. Sarah immediately saw that the intelligence had been incomplete. The compound contained not just the expected meeting participants, but a significant security presence. "Count at least 15 fighters," she whispered to Harrison, "plus the meeting participants. This is much larger than anticipated." "Does that change your assessment of mission feasibility?" Sarah studied the compound layout through her night vision scope. "It changes the approach, but not necessarily the feasibility. The large security presence actually works in our favor." "How?" "They're focused on external threats, not internal security. If we can get inside their perimeter, they won't be expecting trouble from within the compound." Harrison watched her analyze the tactical situation with the same systematic approach she'd used on the weapons cache mission. But this time, the complexity was much greater. Multiple buildings, numerous personnel, uncertain identities, and the proximity to the Pakistani border all created variables that couldn't be controlled through planning. "Sir," Sarah said quietly, "I'm going to recommend that we proceed, but with significant modifications to our original approach." What kind of modifications? Instead of a direct assault, we're going to infiltrate the compound and identify Kadir before initiating contact. Once we know where he is and what his security situation looks like, we can decide whether to attempt capture or elimination. That means inserting personnel into a hostile compound without backup or immediate support. Yes, sir, it's high risk, but it's also our best chance of success given the actual conditions we're facing. Harrison realized he was about to witness the kind of tactical decision-making that made Sarah's reputation. She was choosing the more dangerous option because her analysis suggested it offered the highest probability of mission success. What happened next would determine not only the outcome of this mission, but also his final assessment of Captain Sarah, Phantom 7, Mitchell's capabilities, and their implications for the future of military operations. Sarah's infiltration plan was audacious even by her unit's standards. 2 soldiers would approach the compound from the east, where the security was lightest, penetrate the perimeter, and locate Kadir among the meeting participants. Once his position was confirmed, the rest of the team would execute a coordinated assault to capture or eliminate him. "I'll lead the infiltration element," Sarah announced quietly to her team. "Captain, with respect, that's not your job," Sergeant Thompson protested. "Send me and Rodriguez. You need to coordinate the overall operation." Under normal circumstances, you'd be right. But tonight's operation requires someone who can make real-time tactical decisions without radio communication. If conditions inside the compound require changing our entire approach, I need to be there to make that call. Colonel Harrison understood her logic, but he was troubled by the implications. "Captain, you're asking me to observe while you personally undertake what might be a suicide mission." "Sir, I'm asking you to observe while I do my job. Everything my unit has accomplished over 3 years has been based on taking calculated risks that other units avoid. This is just another calculated risk." The calculation seems heavily weighted toward disaster. Sarah looked directly at him. "Colonel, what would happen if conventional forces attempted this mission with the resources and timeline we have available?" Harrison considered honestly. Conventional forces wouldn't attempt this mission under these conditions. They'd request additional resources, extended timeline, or abort entirely. And Kadir would escape to continue coordinating attacks against our forces and Afghan civilians. Sometimes the choice isn't between good options and bad options. It's between bad options and worse options. At 2200 hours, Sarah and Specialist Martinez began their approach to the compound. Harrison watched through night vision equipment as they moved across open ground toward the eastern perimeter. Their movement was so careful and deliberate that they seemed to fade into the landscape itself. The compound's security was focused outward, watching for conventional threats from the surrounding hills. No one was expecting infiltrators to approach through areas that appeared to offer no concealment. But Sarah had identified subtle terrain features that provided just enough cover for 2 soldiers moving with exceptional skill. It took them 45 minutes to cover 300 meters. Harrison found himself holding his breath as they reached the compound's outer wall, a simple stone barrier about 6 feet high. For several minutes, they remained motionless, apparently listening for activity inside the compound. Then, with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed, both soldiers went over the wall and disappeared from view. Harrison checked his watch. According to the plan, Sarah had 15 minutes to locate Kadir and signal for the assault to begin. If no signal came within that time frame, the mission would be aborted and the infiltration team would attempt to extract independently. The waiting was excruciating. Harrison understood intellectually that Sarah's team had operated successfully for 3 years using these methods, but watching it unfold in real time was unlike anything he'd experienced. The level of trust required, the precision of execution, the acceptance of variables that couldn't be controlled. It all challenged fundamental assumptions about how military operations should be conducted. At 22:52 hours, Harrison's radio crackled softly. Sarah's voice, barely audible. "Overwatch, this is Phantom 7. I have eyes on the primary target. Compound contains 23 individuals, including 3 meeting participants. Primary target confirmed in the main building with minimal immediate security." Harrison keyed his radio carefully. "Phantom 7, this is Overwatch. Understood. What's your recommendation?" "Recommend immediate assault. Security personnel are concentrated on the perimeter. If we move now, we can secure the primary target before they can respond effectively. Copy, execute assault in 60 seconds. Harrison turned to Sergeant Thompson, who was commanding the assault element. You heard the captain, 60 seconds. What followed was a masterpiece of small unit tactical coordination. Thompson's assault element approached the compound from 3 directions simultaneously, breaching the perimeter at points that Sarah had identified during her reconnaissance. The security personnel, caught completely off guard by attacks from inside and outside the compound, were overwhelmed before they could mount an organized resistance. Within minutes, the compound was secured and Kadir was in custody. The entire operation, from infiltration to completion, had taken less than 2 hours. But as they prepared to extract with their prisoner, Sarah's radio crackled with an unexpected transmission. All American forces in the area, this is Pakistani Border Command. You are operating in violation of Pakistani airspace and territorial sovereignty. Withdraw immediately or face interdiction. Harrison felt his stomach drop. Pakistani forces had detected their operation and were demanding immediate withdrawal. But they were still 15 kilometers from friendly territory, carrying a high-value prisoner, through terrain that would require at least 2 hours to traverse. Sarah's voice came through the radio, calm despite the circumstances. All elements, this is Phantom 7. Pakistani forces are responding to our presence. We need to modify our extraction plan immediately. What do you recommend? Harrison asked. Sir, we have 2 options. We can attempt to reach the border before Pakistani forces intercept us, or we can request diplomatic clearance to transit Pakistani territory with our prisoner. Diplomatic clearance could take hours to arrange, assuming it's granted at all. Yes, sir, which means we probably need to outrun them. Harrison found himself facing the kind of decision that would define his career. Ordering American forces to flee Pakistani territory could create an international incident, but allowing Pakistani forces to interfere with the capture of a major Taliban commander could undermine months of counterterrorism operations. Captain, what's the probability that we can reach the border before Pakistani forces intercept us? Depends on how quickly they respond and how familiar they are with the terrain we'll be using. If we move immediately and use unconventional routes, I'd estimate 60% probability of successful extraction. And if Pakistani forces intercept us, we identify ourselves, explain that we're in pursuit of Taliban forces who are operating across the border, and request permission to continue to friendly territory with our prisoner. Harrison made his decision. All right, Captain, execute immediate extraction using unconventional routes. Avoid contact with Pakistani forces if possible, but be prepared to explain our presence if contact occurs. The extraction that followed tested every skill Sarah's team had developed over 3 years of operations. Instead of following obvious routes toward the border, they moved through terrain that appeared impassable, narrow ravines, steep hillsides, rocky areas that offered concealment but made rapid movement extremely difficult. Sarah led the way, somehow finding paths through landscape that seemed designed to prevent human movement. Behind her, the team followed in single file, carrying their equipment and their prisoner through darkness across terrain that would have challenged experienced mountain climbers in daylight. Colonel Harrison, struggling to maintain the pace while carrying his own gear, began to understand why Sarah's grandmother's teachings were so relevant to modern military operations. This wasn't just tactical knowledge. It was an almost mystical understanding of how to move through hostile environment without being detected. At 1:45 hours, they encountered their first Pakistani patrol. American forces, halt immediately. You are in violation of Pakistani sovereignty. Sarah raised her hand, signaling the team to stop. Then she stepped forward, removing her helmet so her face was visible in the Pakistani soldiers' flashlights. I am Captain Sarah Mitchell, United States Marine Corps. We are in pursuit of Taliban forces who attacked American positions and fled across the border. We have captured one high-value target and request permission to continue to American territory. The Pakistani lieutenant in charge of the patrol seemed uncertain how to respond. This wasn't a situation covered in his training. Captain Mitchell, you should have requested permission before entering Pakistani territory. Lieutenant, the Taliban forces we were pursuing didn't request permission either. They attacked an American base and fled across the border to escape retaliation. We followed them to prevent their escape. I must contact my superiors for instructions. Of course, but I hope you'll understand that we need to continue moving. Every minute we delay gives other Taliban forces time to organize rescue attempts for our prisoner. The Pakistani lieutenant studied the situation. Sarah's team was obviously professional military personnel, not raiders or insurgents. Their prisoner was clearly Taliban, not a Pakistani citizen, and their story about cross-border pursuit was plausible. Captain Mitchell, I will allow you to continue, but you must proceed directly to the border without deviation. Any additional military activity in Pakistani territory will be considered hostile action. Understood, Lieutenant. Thank you for your cooperation. As they resumed their movement toward the border, Colonel Harrison reflected on what he'd just witnessed. Sarah hadn't just navigated a complex tactical situation. She'd managed an international diplomatic incident with the same calm professionalism she brought to military operations. At 3:30 hours, they crossed into Afghan territory and established radio contact with their home base. The prisoner transfer was completed without further incident, and by dawn they were back at Forward Operating Base Chapman, having successfully completed a mission that most military experts would have considered impossible. During the debrief, General Morrison asked Colonel Harrison for his preliminary assessment of the night's operations. General, I've observed military operations on 4 different continents over 20 years of service. What Captain Mitchell's unit accomplished tonight exceeded anything I've previously witnessed. In what specific ways? Speed of planning and execution, tactical flexibility under changing conditions, successful completion of mission objectives despite encountering significantly more complex opposition than anticipated, and resolution of potential international incident through field-level diplomacy. General Morrison turned to Sarah. Captain Mitchell, how do you assess tonight's operation? Sir, the mission accomplished its primary objective. However, it also revealed several areas where our procedures need improvement. Such as, our intelligence preparation was inadequate for the timeline available. Our coordination with Pakistani authorities should have been established before we began operations near the border. And our extraction procedures need to be more robust for situations involving high-value prisoners. Harrison was struck by this response. Even after completing what appeared to be a perfect mission, Sarah was focusing on lessons learned and areas for improvement. This wasn't false modesty. It was the mindset of someone who understood that exceptional performance required continuous refinement. Over the following days, as Harrison prepared his final report about Sarah's unit, he found himself grappling with conclusions that challenged his fundamental assumptions about military leadership and capability development. Captain Sarah Mitchell represented something new in his experience, an officer whose capabilities transcended normal military categories. She combined tactical excellence, strategic thinking, cultural awareness, and diplomatic skill in ways that seemed to redefine what individual military professionals could accomplish. The question his report would have to answer was whether her example pointed toward new possibilities for military education and development, or whether she was simply an exceptional individual whose methods couldn't be replicated. As he wrote his conclusions, Harrison realized that observing Sarah's unit had changed his own understanding of what military leadership could become. Whether the Marine Corps would choose to pursue those possibilities remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. Captain Sarah, Phantom 7, Mitchell had demonstrated capabilities that would influence military thinking for years to come. In his final conversation with her before departing Afghanistan, Harrison asked one last question. Captain, do you believe that what you've accomplished here can be replicated by other officers in other locations? Sarah considered carefully before answering. Sir, I believe that every officer has the potential to exceed what they think they're capable of. Whether they realize that potential depends on the opportunities they're given and the experiences they're willing to learn from. And the specific methods your unit has developed. The specific methods aren't as important as the mindset behind them. Willingness to question assumptions, adapt to changing conditions, take calculated risks, and accept responsibility for the consequences. Those qualities can be developed by anyone who's serious about being the best leader they can become. As Colonel Harrison flew back to the United States, he reflected on the implications of what he'd witnessed. The Marine Corps was about to receive a report that would challenge conventional wisdom about military training, leadership development, and the limits of individual capability. Whether that report would lead to meaningful change or simply be filed away, as an interesting anomaly, would depend on decisions made by officers who had never met Captain Sarah Mitchell and had no direct experience with what she'd accomplished. But for Harrison himself, the experience had been transformative. He now understood that exceptional military leadership wasn't just about following procedures or managing resources. It was about developing the wisdom to make life-and-death decisions in complex, uncertain situations where the stakes couldn't be higher. And occasionally, it was about individuals who transcended normal expectations to achieve what seemed impossible. Captain Sarah, Phantom 7, Mitchell was one of those individuals.